Ethan, I feel like you need a voiceover here. Are you an NCME member? Annual member is just $95 for professionals. Student membership is free for year one. Just $45 annually thereafter.
What
Receive
a
2
deal.
monthly journals, access to free special interest group communities, significant discounts on future programming, and more. Visit www.ncme.org and join today.
You have a new career, Derek.
So welcome everybody that's joining. We'll be starting shortly. Okay, I think we're ready to get going. Suzanne, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Derek. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session, Teaching and Learning, Educational Measurement, Defining the Discipline. My name is Suzanne Lane, and I'm a professor in the Educational Measurement and Statistics program at the University of Pittsburgh, and I will serve as the moderator for this session. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our panelists for the session. Dan Bolt is a professor in the Educational Psychology Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he regularly teaches courses on test construction, factor analysis, and test theory. His research interests include multidimensional item response theory, the study and measurement of student growth, non-cognitive skills, and psychometric models for novel item types. Derek Briggs is a professor in the Research and Evaluation Methodology program at the University of Colorado School of Education. He is also the director of the Center for Assessment Design, Research and Evaluation and president-elect for NCME. Derek's research agenda focuses upon building sound methodological approaches for the measurement and evaluation of growth in student learning. Our third panelist is Andrew Ho, who is the Charles William Eliot Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. His research aims to improve the design, use, and interpretation of test scores in educational policy and practice. He teaches a course on statistical and psychometric methods for educational measurement and a course on intermediate and advanced statistical methods for applied educational research. He advises students in doctoral and master's programs related to educational policy and analysis. Our fourth panelist is Jennifer Randall, who is an associate professor in the Research, Educational Measurement, and Psychometrics program at UMass. She is presently interested in the differential negative impact of both small and large-scale assessments on historically marginalized populations in the United States and abroad, and the ways in which a culturally responsive approach to assessment can mitigate those negative impacts. She teaches courses in measurement theory, scale development, statistics, and classroom assessment. The purpose of this session is to build upon another session that discussed a curricular review of 135 doctoral programs in the United States. The panelists will address the following motivating questions. What do you see as the core or base ideas and methods of educational measurement to which our graduate students should be exposed? To what extent does this match what happens now? What are the challenges in preparing students? How should we be teaching these ideas and methods to our students? And how can NCME as an organization play a positive role in moving this important conversation forward. Each panelist will have approximately 10 minutes to respond to one or more of these questions. This will be followed by a discussion amongst the panelists, and then attendees will have the opportunity to pose questions. For all of those in attendance, please use the chat box to pose questions, and during this session, I will call on you so that you can indicate what your question is. Okay, we're going to begin with Dan, and then Derek, and then Andrew, and then Jennifer in alphabetical order. Dan, would you like to begin?
All right, thanks very much, Suzanne, and thanks also to Derek for organizing this symposium and for inviting me to participate, as well as to all of our attendees for joining this session. I'm really looking forward to the ensuing discussion. I know it's been a while since we were first emailing about this symposium, and I've very much appreciated the opportunity it's provided for me to do some of my own critical thinking about graduate training in measurement, in particular in regards to the program here at Wisconsin. I'll also say I enjoyed very much attending the graduate training webinar a few weeks ago, and so some of what I have to say is in part a reaction to that webinar, which I found to be very informative and constructive. So in regard to this first question about the core or base ideas of educational measurement, I'll have to say that my answer is to a large extent shaped by the fact that I view our discipline as very cumulative and in many ways rather linear type of discipline. It's of course fair to acknowledge that the practice of measurement has changed over time and that we go through some shifts in what matters to us in terms of measurement, as well as the types of models and techniques that we apply in different measurement contexts, for example. But to me, at least, the major questions and thus the core ideas don't really change. And I think we do our field a bit of a disservice if we try too hard to alter some of the basic ideas that we were all trained before entering this field. So I may sound kind of old school, but I think the core or base ideas of measurement are still those that are very much embodied by the primary test theories that we have developed to answer the major questions of measurement. I know in my classes, like I think a lot of others, I like to talk about classical true score theory, item response theory, and factor analytic theories of measurement. And I like to keep those theories sort of prominent in how the various methods of the class are talked about. I kind of like also how Lord and Novick, present still other theories besides these, just so students are kind of aware of what a test theory is and can better appreciate what a test theory is supposed to do for us. So I think it's important in presenting test theories to not present them as sort of abstract inventions, but to connect them to the very practical questions they were designed to help us address. Questions like, how should we be scoring our tests? Can we report more than one score from our test performances? How should we interpret the score scale? How do we determine how much error is in the score, and so on and so forth? And then, over the duration of the semester, it's good to talk about how reliability and validity essentially become operationalized within these test theories. I think the word test theory has developed kind of a negative connotation, which I think is kind of unfortunate. I think anytime we try to talk in atheoretic ways about measurement, we quickly find ourselves in a place where we no longer understand what we mean by measurement error, for example, and the practical value of whatever method is being applied is consequently lost. So I'm kind of embarrassed to say that the ultimate role of test theory in helping to address these questions isn't something I probably really came to appreciate until I had to teach my first measurement theory course, and then you kind of come to see how it plays such a big role. So I also think it's obviously important to talk about the assumptions of these different theories, how they overlap and where they differ. I think one of the things that I really appreciate about Rod McDonald's test theory book is that he does exactly that in showing how the common factor model, for instance, provides a nice language and perspective by which all three of the different test theories I mentioned above can be understood and compared. I think that general emphasis on test theory also makes it possible to talk about new types of test theories. So one of the limitations of a CTT or IRT type of approach is that it very much emphasizes measures as reflective indicators of the constructs that we're trying to measure, even though there are lots of settings where that isn't really the case. And so, you know, to be able to talk about network psychometrics, which is sort of a kind of a new emerging theory, largely developed by the folks at University of Amsterdam, I think becomes a useful thing to talk about and to sort of lay it alongside some of these more familiar measurement theories. Denny Borsboom actually has a really great instructional video on the Psychometric Society website that kind of provides an overview of psychometrics and is able to talk about all these different theories and how they kind of provide a basis for what we talk about. And so if you haven't already seen it, it's something I really encourage you to look at. There are a couple of areas, specific areas I would always like to see more discussed in educational measurement training. One area is generalizability theory, which you know, I think is an area we need to give more attention to. Part of what I think makes G theory very useful is it gets students to appreciate the complexity of most real-world measurement settings. And I think it's a complexity that's only increasing with many of the more modern contemporary assessments. It also forces students to think more carefully about the types of inferences they want to draw in measurement and how such inferences and the quantifications of relevant measurement error should impact the design of assessments. G theory is obviously somewhat complex in terms of its implementation, so it's a hard topic to present in that respect, but I think to present the basics of G theory should increasingly be viewed as sort of one of the core things we talk about in measurement courses. Another area I don't think we talk about as much as we should have is the area of scaling, specifically how we develop the metrics that we use in measurement and how those metrics affect the interpretations we try to derive from measures. We talk a lot about measurement error, which is of course important, but I think many of the thorny issues of measurement relate more to problems of metric. So I think it's important to talk about this more in our measurement courses as well. And then the third area I would like to see talk more about is just related issues of fairness and equity. You know, in this day and age, these are the things that are being talked about and are the biggest concerns in virtually all forms of standardized testing. And so I think to sort of place ourselves in a cocoon and pretend like we're only concerned with statistical models and methods in this regard is a big mistake. And you know, to be honest, it's an area I struggle with as far as how to best talk about this, but I think its importance as a core issue can't really be denied. So that's my answer to the sort of the first question. Have I used up too much time? I'm not even following my time.
You have about 3 more minutes.
Okay, well, let me go more quickly through the second question then. And the second question is, to what extent does this sort of thing happen now, and what are the challenges we face in preparing students? So in answering this question, I think we can probably talk more about our program at Wisconsin. I think it probably is sort of true of other programs as well, but you know, don't want to overstate that. You know, I think to a large extent, we probably focus too much on specific methods and the mechanics of those methods than we do on the big questions of measurement when we do measurement training. I think part of the unfortunate reason for that is that it seems to be maybe a better match to our incoming students' strengths and interests, and maybe less so what is actually needed by an educational measurement practitioner, at least a competent one. So I know one of the comments that was raised in the earlier webinar from someone in the testing industry concerned how graduate programs were doing such a good job, it seemed at least, in training students in areas of statistical computing and graphical displays of data and such. And my reaction, at least at Wisconsin, is I don't think we have anything to do with that. I think those are the sorts of skills students are already bringing to our graduate program. You know, I've had more than one occasion where I present a method and somebody comes up to me after class and says, you know, there's a much more efficient way you can actually do what you're trying to do. And it's led me to realize this isn't the area where our students need the most training. I think, you know, more so it's in kind of understanding more about the concepts of measurement and how they apply in kind of unique and different types of measurement contexts. I think, you know, increasingly it's hard to just sort of take kind of a cookbook approach to measurement. You know, more important is to help students kind of develop critical thinking skills so that they can look at a problem, they can attempt to understand what does measurement error mean in this context, what, you know, sorts of validation evidence are most meaningful in this context. And so rather than teaching a whole bunch of methods, I find it much more useful to try to make our students more critical evaluators of a measurement situation and train them in terms of how to go to look into the toolbox of techniques, you know, that is huge toolbox of techniques that we now have in order to pick out the appropriate ones for a particular setting. You know, I think part of how we present test theory is also a little bit of a problem. I think we often portray our measurement theories as much more narrow than they should be viewed. We tend to take kind of cookie cutter approaches, or present cookie cutter examples in terms of the ideas. So when we talk about classical true score theory, you know, we talk about in the context of a fixed paper and pencil test. What we need to do is try to move much more rapidly, I think, to talking about how these ideas are still relevant and applicable in much more complex measurement situations when dealing with process data, for example, or when working with response times as opposed to just dealing with item correctness, or when dealing with a simulation task, for instance, as a basis for assessment instead of one that has a nice bunch of items, you know, that we can pick a model and
Dan, I hate to interrupt you, but maybe we can save the last question during the discussion. You can get your comments in.
Sure. So why don't I, would it be best if I just sort of end there and we'll move to the next?
Your last final words for this section.
Final words, okay. Well, part of this question was about practical limitations. Another obvious practical limitation we face is the simple limited amount of class time we have with our students. It becomes increasingly hard to offer courses that we would like to offer courses with in particular areas of educational measurement. And part of that is just due to the restrictions the university places on class size. And so this is another challenge that we are regularly facing in terms of our actual educational measurement training. So I obviously had more thoughts I was going to share, but thank you for stopping me because I don't want to in any way intrude on our other panelists.
Thanks, Dan, and please share those thoughts during the discussion section.
Yeah, good.
See, I knew I'd chose a good moderator. I knew Suzanne wouldn't be afraid to get in there, and I'm sure she'll do the same to me here because I'm sure I'll run over as well. Thanks a lot, Dan. That was great lead off, and a lot of really helpful thoughts. And I think it'll be very interesting to see to what extent there's overlap. We haven't sort of coordinated ahead of time to collate these, so it'll be interesting to see where there's overlap and where there's not amongst us. So I did give some thought to this question, and I'm going to tackle this a little bit more, whereas I think Dan has given us sort of a nice holistic thought about what he's thinking about in terms of foundational concepts and ideas. I actually thought it was a good exercise for me to sit down and actually write out descriptions of what I thought the foundational concepts were. And I've broken them into 4 groups. One, that I think what are foundational concepts and statistics that students need to know. And I know this is focused on psychometrics and educational measurement, but I think much of psychometrics builds on core concepts that are in statistics. And if you don't have those core concepts, what we're doing in psychometrics actually presupposes understanding of them. So I wanted to start with that. Then I'm going to go to some areas that are specific to psychometrics, and then turn to measurement. Finally, I'll mention some foundational skills. So first, in statistics, key thing are descriptive statistics and graphical visualizations, knowing how to do those sorts of things. Probability and distributions, in particular, working with random variables, expected values, variances, what you do when you have 2 different random variables that you're adding. Just enough asymptotic theory to keep you honest. Just enough Bayesian ideas attempt you to cheat. Basics of hypothesis testing and ANOVA, you should have an introduction to statistical power. You should understand type 1 and type 2 errors. Analysis of contingency tables. Hold on here. There we go. The classical linear regression model and ordinary least squares, logistic regression, maximum likelihood estimation. Now, these are all the sorts of things that I think really the best way to get these actually is often not, you may get them as part of a School of Education or a psychology graduate program. You may get them in sort of introductory courses that all graduate students take, but to some extent, those courses often aren't enough. And so often need to be supplemented by taking a more mathematical statistics course. That could be, I actually got a grounding in this by taking a 2-semester course in econometrics. You know, these aren't things that are often emphasized in a great deal of detail in your typical education or graduate psychology graduate program. Oh, the other thing that's I think often underappreciated is, do you have some just basic understandings of matrix algebra? It's really hard to start understanding factor analysis if you don't understand some basics of matrix algebra. So now let's turn to foundational concepts in psychometrics. I think here I would focus on, this is something Dan mentioned as well, classical theory of reliability and measurement error. And that seems like two sort of basic concepts, but really to understand those in a deep way, to understand where the concept of reliability came from, how it relates to measurement error. In some ways, these are, the best way to understand these would probably be the opening section of Lord and Novick. Now, we typically don't use that for incoming graduate students, but it's but the complexity of these concepts are clear when you actually go into those chapters. So really getting students to understand what reliability, how to think of reliability, and that there actually is no one reliability potentially is a very complicated thing. And getting people to understand conceptually what we mean by measurement error and how that can depend on what we think is being replicated is also very complicated. This, I think, leads into generalizability theory. Dan just mentioned how this is really a valuable thing that we probably don't spend enough time on. But generalizability theory really helps as a follow-up from classical test theory, because it helps people understand how there can be multiple facets of error and different ways of conceptualizing what error actually means. From here, one of the courses I teach really focuses quite a bit on item response theory. And there's a lot that's packed into the parentheses that I've placed here, presenting the general models for dichotomous and polytonously scored items. I focus in particular, as a contrast, the Lord and Birnbaum tradition in presenting a taxonomy of IRT models versus the Roche tradition of how the Roche model was formulated, because I think it makes for a nice contrast how these models can be derived to solve different sorts of problems and with different objectives in mind. A lot of attention on assumptions and tests of fit, and parameter estimation is another thing that people need to have some familiarity with. I think I've called out in particular this point, the property of invariance and why it's important, getting graduate students to understand what we mean by invariance and why that's such an important issue to be thinking about. Use of classical IRT methods for applications. So in particular, the main applications that students should have some exposure to are the use of these methods for horizontal equating, vertical scaling, computer adaptive testing, and to check for differential item functioning. These are all things that graduate students should have at least an introductory exposure to as part of their program. And then finally, factor analysis. Here, exploratory and confirmatory models and the relationship of these models to multidimensional IRT and to classical test theory. I think Dan makes a really nice point in Roderick McDonald's book does a really nice job of showing the relationships between these. I think we do a real disservice when students sometimes walk out of graduate programs without realizing that there are relationships among these models and thinking that these are very distinct things. In particular, I think Dan has a long history of being frustrated at people thinking that multidimensional IRT is this very different thing than factor analysis, when that's really not so much the case. Let me turn now to foundational concepts in measurement. And I actually distinguish this from psychometrics a bit, because I think there are a lot of things that we do in educational measurement that are not focused specifically on statistical modeling. And I think much of psychometrics is focused on the modeling aspects, and that's much of what I captured in that last slide. But in measurement, I think, is a little bit broader. And so here are some of the aspects that I think are important here. In particular, I think it's important for people to have a historical context of where educational measurement came from and where a lot of the foundational concepts in educational measurement got their start. And I think it's really important to provide this context, especially when the context can be troubling or controversial. I don't think we appreciate enough that there have always been controversies around the use of measurement for a variety of purposes. To this end, I actually have a book I've been working on for about 3 years. It's called Credos and Controversies, Historical and Conceptual Foundations of Measurement in the Human Sciences. And I try very hard in that book to actually get into some of these controversial parts of our history. I think, just as a quick note, in the previous panel session, there was this was also raised as an issue. And the question is, where do you have time to fit this in? I think you need to nest it in whenever you're presenting new concepts. It's helpful to give a context of historically where these things came from. I think that's the place to do it, as opposed to having it be a separate course necessarily. Okay, there we go. An introduction to philosophy of science. What do students know about empiricism, Popper, Kuhn, scientific realism, critical theories? Intro to theories of learning, behaviorism, cognitive models, sociocultural models. Intro to principles and approaches to item design. The role of standardization. And this means more than just standardization and test administration, which I think what a lot of people think about, but it also means very much how we go about interpreting the results from a measurement procedure. How we establish reference units, for example, is an important topic. Validity versus validation. I think this is one of the best contributions Danny Boersma actually made in the article he wrote on the concept of validity, to help us understand that there is a distinction to be made between issues of epistemology and issues of ontology. And we actually have to appreciate that there's a distinction in the terms validity and validation, where validity is really often a question that's best concerned with questions of ontology, and validation is best concerned with questions of epistemology. And here is actually not so much necessarily a concept, but sort of one thing that I hope all my students leave our program with, and it's the following, which is that testing does not guarantee measurement, and measurement does not need to entail tests. I worry that in NCME, we have somehow gotten to this sort of notion that all testing is measurement, right? And that you can't do measurement without tests. And I think that's a problematic position. Another related stipulation is that not all assessments are tests. Okay,
Derek,
lastly,
I hate to do this, just another minute or so.
Right, gotcha, I got you, thank you. I'll just mention these foundational skills, and I'll save my comments on what makes it challenging to handle all these things for our discussion. So just quickly for foundational skills, coding. It's really important that graduate students leave with some really strong coding skills. We really focus in our program on coding in R. Presenting and defending an argument, doing this orally in real time, and writing when you have time. So those are two different skills, and we try to work with our students to be able to do both of those things. Asking questions and listening. You might not think of those as skills, but those are critical skills. And it's really hard to learn how to ask good questions and also how to listen carefully about the answers you're getting. And the last one is giving a good conference presentation. Last really important foundational skill. And with that, I'll turn over my time, to pass the baton, I should say, to Andrew Ho.
Thanks, Derek. Can you all hear me? Give me a thumbs up. Great. Yeah, and as part of giving a good conference presentation, that entails ending on time, which I am sure I will fail to do, just as my two previous speakers have done. So I start with modesty and humility. So I'm going to start by trying to share my screen here. Let's see here, and let's see. Okay, so. And I'm guessing, can you give me a thumbs up if you see this cover slide? Great. Okay, so so thank you all for having me. I reflect too that like part of the mantra for online pedagogy is you shouldn't be cramming too many things into an hour and a half, and here we're trying to cram as much as possible, and also in a meta way talking about cramming as much as possible into a program, right? As Derek was saying, it's like, what do we cut? I'm reminded of Howard Wayner's like 13 conversations about 3 things, that fun piece he did about 10 years ago, where it's like for everything you put forward, you have to take something off. And so I think I look forward to the discussion where we say, actually, this topic is not worth teaching. I can't wait to do that. So here's an overview of my remarks over the next 10 minutes or so. And I apologize if my internet connection cuts out because I've got 2 girls downstairs on Zoom calls in summer camp. But here are my 5 topics. First, I just want to reflect briefly on NCME's mission and goals as a member of the board in my 3rd and final year. I just want to remind us that we've changed those slightly, and I think their change is important and consistent with the direction perhaps our field and profession may want to go. I want to talk a little bit about our 2 sacred texts. We can debate how many there actually are. I want to pose 3 reflections from my learning and teaching in general, talk about 2 threats or maybe their opportunities, data science and economics, and then reflect about the 3 hardest things to teach. And as you can see, I'm going to talk a little bit less about topics because I knew that Dan and Derek were going to talk about those, and talk a little bit more about like dispositions, the co-curricular and extracurricular things that Derek, I think, closed his last remarks with. So first, I just want to remind you that on the board, I was really proud of the fact that we adjusted our mission and goals with feedback from membership recently. The National Council on Measurement and Education's community of measurement scientists and practitioners. So emphasis on community here, who work together to advance theory and applications of educational measurement. And this was also added to benefit society. And I thought that was befitting of something that's not just a scholarship, but like National Council on Measurement in education. What does that education part mean? And I appreciated that mission. And also that we have these goals that I think are important, including policy and practice, right? And so as we think about like what an NCME member should be trained in, right? There should be training, I think, that reflects like all of these sorts of, all of these sorts of dimensions, not just science and scholarship, but engagement with an area of application, right? And that's going to be, I think, one of the thesis of mine, potentially our remarks today, that there has to be more than theory. There should be an area of substantive application that every person in this profession engages with deeply. I want to talk briefly about our 2, and I should mention, just to reiterate what Derek said, again, for all the graduate students here, and I see a few of them, if you are not yet members, and maybe I sneaked you a Zoom invite, membership is free, and both for the first year and your second year, given the current crisis, so don't hesitate to apply. So this is what I believe are our 2 sacred texts. I'd love it if you were to disagree somehow or add a third. But the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing and Ed Measurement, 4th edition. I just want to like look through the topics because I think they are at a macro level what Dan and Derek were defining at more of a micro level, and say that it's pretty well established, right? We have validity/validation. We can debate that. Reliability, precision, errors of measurement, et cetera. Fairness, as Dan was mentioning. Design and development. So this is and here we can focus in particular on educational testing and assessment with potential for program evaluation and policy studies and accountability and the like. But that's the AERA and CME standards, right? And then if you look at Ed Measurement 4th edition, you see a lot of parallels, right? You see all of these topics. They could essentially form the basis of a sequence in a program in any one of our programs. And we might ask at this high level, what are we missing? And I think at this high level, what we are missing is in part, you can't see here, let me admit, oh, hey, Eva, another one of my students. This is Educational Measurement 4th edition in 2006. As I think many of you know now, we also have Educational Measurement 5th edition, 2022, at least that's what we're on track for now. And there are some nods here to what Derek was talking about. First, a chapter on history, an additional chapter that Derek is co-authoring on the nature of measurement, in addition to some of the tried and true topics from previous editions. And I'm proud to be co-authoring this assessment for accountability in K-12 education with Morgan Polikoff. So that is interesting to see too, again, how our past editions might have missed something that our current editions are adding. And I look forward to thinking when the 5th edition is out, what we have missed for the 6th. Okay, so now to get more to the task at hand here, here are 3 general reflections on teaching and learning, and this maybe is not yet measurement specific, but over my past like 20 odd years now of teaching, I'm older than I look. These are 3 topics that I think are 3 principles of learning that are particularly salient in measurement, perhaps. Right? First, for quantitative knowledge, it's incredibly difficult to learn something. It takes multiple exposures. I describe it as layering, this process of varnishing over like a piece of wood. You need multiple exposures. And my clearest example of this is learning from Ed Hartle. I took his IRT class in 2002, did just fine, really appreciated everything that was there. And he's a great instructor. And then I went to ETS for a summer internship and realized that I knew nothing, that none of it really sank in for me. And I actually went back and took the same course again the next year, and it was like a totally different course. I saw it with new eyes, right? And we get the same thing at Harvard when students come through the program, they learn in a class, and then they become teaching fellows, teaching assistants in the class. And they're like, oh my goodness, it never sunk in the first time. And so I think that as we design our programs, we have to give an opportunity for multiple exposures and not just assume that because someone saw something 2 years ago that they still remember it. Second is this idea of learning mindset. And I'm always curious about how many people we push out of our program by saying, you don't know it and therefore you never will, and how we actually explicitly teach that what I do not know is what I have not learned yet, with that emphasis on yet. Because I think that if, did I know what regression discontinuity was in 2005? I barely, right? And so all of these new methods that are going to come along are the methods we have for dealing with process data now, data science now. Like, you always have to be in the spirit of learning new things, and how we try to teach that and instantiate that, I think, is really important. And third and finally, like the know, do, and be of it all. I think we talked a lot about the know. Derek began to talk a little bit about the do and the coding especially. And we have to think a little bit more, I think, about the be of it all, and how to like give people the feeling of being a testing and measurement expert or psychometrician or whatever you want to call them, perhaps by giving people the opportunity to mentor junior students so they actually realize how much more they know than junior students do. Also internship opportunities, which, as many of you know, many of these were cut short this year, unfortunately, for perhaps understandable reasons. How can we boost those up again? So I think that we have to focus on the be and not just the know and the do. I think TACs, technical advisory committees, are yet another way that we can give students exposure to what it really means to act as a testing and measurement expert in the real world. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple of threats, or let's call them opportunities. Who's stealing our students, or what are our students also attracted to, and what can we learn from them, is one way to provocatively say this, right? So what does data science have that we don't have, right? And I think that one thing we can learn from data science is their general approach to just hacking and making it work. This isn't always a laudable thing, but I think it's something, they make stuff and they make stuff work, and it doesn't always work well, and we love critiquing it. But that spirit of hacking is something that I think that psychometricians and measurement experts could use a little more of. Second, economics and the art of asking causal or policy relevant questions, right? The causal framework in economics is extremely compelling, certainly at a school like Harvard, where folks are very interested in policy and practice. So by contrast, I think, and I've long worried about this, I think measurement risks being a you can't do that field. And I think we are rightfully cautious given our history and the misuse we see everywhere of our tests. But I worry that because we always say you can't do that, we are losing some students who really want to hack and create, and also want to ask really compelling questions, not say, oh, you can't answer that question, but really actually focus in a laser-like way on answering a question. And I think there's 2 things we can learn. These are 2 things we can learn from data science and economics, respectively, that I hope we inject a little bit more into our field. Again, how do we hack and create things a little bit more? How do we get a little bit more creative and create more? And also, how do we like frame questions in a really compelling way for policy and perhaps in a causal way? And so fifth,
Andrew, a couple more minutes.
Yep, this is it. Fifth, these I'm going to close with the 3 hardest things I found to teach that are sort of measurement related. First, to Derek's point about validation, how many times do we hear that you can't say like we validate a test? Why is it so hard to put purpose first? And why do we always get folks who are designing measures who don't ask first, how are you going to interpret and use your scores? What is it about that way of thinking that novice students have where they find it? And I've found it so hard to shift to purpose first, right? And so again, this is one of those things that takes multiple exposures, layering, varnishing, and the like. Second, and Derek referenced this as well, connections to other statistical frameworks is something that I think we have to do multiple times over. Frame everything in terms of generalized mixed effects models potentially as an overarching framework or an overarching framework of your choice, but show things in different ways, right? Show that you can do things one way, you know, using a logit specification, another using a logistic, and it's the same thing, and just give people that sort of mental flexibility. Here's the IRT approach, here's the factor analytic approach, here's the regression approach, here's the the random effects approach, right? Because I think that we're going to keep seeing people, you know, askew, cross paths with each other when they don't realize that they're talking about the same thing. And third, I'll close with this. I think we need to focus a lot more on what substantive differences, substantively meaningful differences really are. We have a lot of fancy methods, many of which are good for very specific purposes, but don't always make a difference for other purposes. So for which questions is a fancier method really necessary? I so often think in what we do that simpler is better, but it's not always better, and we have to be specific about when and for what purpose that is. So I think these are three questions that are really hard to teach. They take multiple exposures to teach them, and it's that level of engagement that I hope we can continue our discussion today, in addition to a list of topics. Wonderful. So this is that's my overview, and I will pass it now to Jennifer.
Thank you, Andrew. So Suzanne, I am going to be your favorite panelist because I promise I will finish with a goodly amount of time left at the end so we can have a discussion. So I want to start by saying I agree with, I think, all of the points that the panelists have made prior to here, especially around the technical concepts that we feel like students should have. And of course, I'm hesitant not to enthusiastically right now cite all of the content that I teach as absolutely the most critical. But I want to shift the conversation a little bit and just talk about what I feel like is really what's missing. You know, I think that despite our best efforts, that educational measurement, of course, is not and simply can't be this purely objective process. That all measurement is haunted by past practices, both good and bad, and subject to current interpretations that reflect the values and the goals, primarily of what I refer to as the power class, often at the expense of the minoritized class. And I argue that graduate training that does not include substantive consideration of both the historical and current socio-cultural and political context of education and or schooling, however we want to define it, is fundamentally flawed and inadequate for the work that we need to do. And I would like for us as an organization, meaning NCME, engage in a discussion about how we, measurement programs, can produce graduates that have both the technical skills required by the field, as well as a more comprehensive understanding of the deeply rooted and nuanced context in which those skills were going to be ultimately applied. So in a session that was a few weeks ago, where the educators for Measurement SIGME, we did this curricular review that was conducted with myself and my colleague, Joseph Rios at the University of Minnesota. We found that most programs didn't offer even a single course in educational policy, one that focused on diversity issues or issues of inclusion or issues of equity, or provided a history of education at all. Of course, some did, and some had several, but most did not, if we looked across master's and doctoral programs. And again, given the fact that measurement doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that the context in which it happens is critical, that lack of available coursework to provide students with that context is really discomforting. As the US population of students and even adult test takers shift, right? According to the US Census, approximately 1/3 of the population is Black and Hispanic right now, and those numbers are growing. And we also have this increasing calls from scholars in the broader field of education for instructional and assessment practices that are culturally responsive. I think it's really important that doctoral students more than ever should be required to take courses that provide them with that historical and contemporary lens of education especially for historically marginalized groups. And another study that I conducted with my colleague Joseph Rios, where we looked at data from the survey of earned doctorates from 1997 to 2016, we found that approximately 30% of all of graduates from US doctoral measurement programs were international students, suggesting that much of the field's professional supply is international, which would mean they would have limited experience with the politics of American education and the history of marginalization. We wouldn't assume that those students would just garner that information or knowledge. We shouldn't just assume that they would garner that knowledge or understanding from somewhere else, someone other than our doc programs. But we really should provide them or require them to situate that measurement expertise within the larger context of our shifting society. This counter argument has already been made by some of my colleagues, time. This is always what we talk about, but what about time? Students just don't have time to take so many classes. If we add these classes in about the history of education or measurement or theories of social justice, then what do we have to take away? To that, I would say that we found on average, doc students take less than 60 credit hours of classes. And that includes dissertation credit classes, classes that are like research theses-based classes, research group classes. So I say it's not unreasonable to expect them to take one or two more. And even if you disagree with point one, my response is that, one can infer what is valued by a program by looking at their curricular content and what they require. So if individuals from a historically marginalized group, Black and brown high school students living in Flint, Michigan, for example, if they were to examine your curriculum, would they feel like your program valued them? That being said, I think we could all probably do a much better job just integrating anti-racist and culturally responsive practices into our traditional measurement courses, which would also help build that context. Pass it back to you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all of the panelists. Right now we have just about 20-25 minutes for a discussion. If you have any comments or questions to the other panelists, feel free to use this time. Or if there's something that you wanted to say and I cut you off, and I apologize, this is the time to do it.
It's hard to follow on that, on what Jennifer, you had to say. That appreciate all the points that you made there, Jennifer. And so let me take up some of the issues that you raised there, Jennifer, and I'll do that in the context of like one last slide I was gonna give that talks about the challenges that we face with a lot of the core concepts. Let me just add that slide in so I have it. Okay. So one of the challenges, before just a brief challenge I want to mention, I think we all have to sort of deal with, which is that there are so many things that we want graduate students to have some facility with, and there's a tendency to sometimes go wide, and it's unclear like what the sacrifice is in potentially not going deep enough on some things. And so that's something I'm constantly struggling with. And this actually connects to something that Andrew said, which is that it's not as though if you just expose graduate students to something, they've necessarily learned it at all. And we all, I think, face that. I mean, I didn't really learn item response theory in the way that I feel like I should have until I started having to teach it. It was really, it's been the act of teaching that helped me really come to grips with what I really understood. So, what was really important was I had to think back about, what were the breadcrumbs that I was provided as a graduate student that made it easier for me to then garner some sophistication later on. So this question of how you help students go deep or wide is a big one. The small programs issue, this is sort of alluded to a little bit by Dan, and it's when you're in a small program like that, this is, I'm going to sort of get at part of Jennifer's point here, which is that it's really difficult to define like what is an educational measurement program, because there aren't really very many educational measurement programs. They typically exist within a larger quantitative methods program, or sort of a research, like we're called research and evaluation methodology, right? And so we don't admit students that are just coming in to do, even if their interests are educational measurement, they exist within a larger program. And so while those of us in the program that teach courses in psychometrics and educational measurement might not be offering the sorts of things that Jennifer was asking for, within our larger program, we absolutely do. And so within our, our students, when they come in, they actually almost have like a liberal arts type curriculum where our incoming graduate students have to take 2 semesters of qualitative methods. They have to take 3 semesters of big picture topics in education, much of which deals with classroom learning issues, educational policy issues, history. We have a requirement on democracy, diversity, and social justice themes. So if you were only looking at that which we teach, which is educational measurement, you would say that was missing. If you look at our larger program, it's there. But I don't mean to say that as sort of trying to excuse away a problem that I think we do face, which is that I don't think we integrate those very well. That is, we expect students to get this larger context for education in the other courses they take, but how are we integrating what we do in our methods courses around measurement so that it's seen as a larger whole? That I think is quite challenging. And I'm asking myself at this present time, and I'm going to stop here because I'd love to get people's reactions. I'm not sure what it, like, I'm asking myself, what does it mean to be an anti-racist psychometrician, right? Like, how does one, when I teach, how do I think about that and make that present? And I don't actually have a great answer to that. So I'd be curious to hear what other folks thought about that question and some of the things I've mentioned here, just trying to take up some of the issues that Jennifer just raised.
I mean, I'll just reflect that I have no simple answer, and that it's something I have been reflecting about and will continue to reflect about. It's not like you can cover it in the 20 minutes before you talk about diff, right? That's just doesn't do it service, and in fact, like, getting students used to talking about it doesn't serve in a lecture course. So it almost like gets back to the kind of pedagogy that we engage in our programs that are, I think, still predominantly lecture-based. I think to even get students used to, and not to mention faculty members who weren't trained well in this and are still, I'll speak for myself, I'm still learning how to do this, just finding these spaces to have the conversations where you ask the question you just asked, Derek, right? And we give examples, and Tukufu Zuberi is my current example for like the article, and that helps. It's just mostly thinking about, again, it goes back to simple misattribution of statistics that belong to a person and not the structures and history before it. But those kinds of articles, and not just like reading those articles to students, but actively engaging and hearing them and creating space for them to share their experience with that. I think that's what we have. So it's co-curricular, right? It's not just something you can lecture about. That's how I'm sort of thinking about it now. And of course, the other thing we have to address in NCME and the field more generally is just representation, period, right? No amount of theory can solve the fact that our demographics don't reflect the world that we're trying to improve. And so I think that there's a lot we have to do in the pipeline, and a lot that we have to do, time we have to allocate towards increasing representation in this membership body and beyond. But it's definitely something I'm still a novice at, below basic, if you will. But back to learning mindset. I mean, it's something that I'm committed to improve upon.
Yeah. So another thing I just think is a big challenge for us is, and it's also related, it's just, I find it's just so challenging to keep up and adapt to new developments in the field. It is true that there are some core areas that I hope will never change, but there are also new things happening all the time. So Dan mentioned some of them, that, for example, with assessments that are being digitally administered, there are now increasing interest in scenario-based assessments that is just such a departure from things we've seen before. And mentioned like network psychometrics and the things that Denny and his colleagues are doing at University of Amsterdam. You know, keeping up with all those things while maintaining expertise in your one area so that you can actually offer the right kind of mentorship and guidance to your graduate students is extraordinarily challenging, I find. So that is one of the things that how do I keep abreast of what's going on so I know enough to give good advice? So I'd be curious if anybody has any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think this is a really good, a very good point, and to me is one of the critical challenges in putting together that syllabus each semester and deciding what to include and what not to include. It's part of what also motivates my thinking that I can't spend as much time talking about the mechanics of implementing a particular procedure, knowing that I've got all these other things to talk about. I certainly want to give them exposure to these other areas and to these other fields, to at a minimum talk about them from sort of 35,000 feet so that they're familiar, that they're aware that they're out there, and they're aware as to their purpose and so forth. But to go back to the point that was raised earlier, something then has to go. And to me, I feel like what has to go is some of this more mechanical stuff that I feel like students are so good at carrying out and figuring out on their own. I know being able to work in R is really important, but increasingly the students that come into my class, they're better at R than I am, and I'm not going to spend time talking about R programming with them or how to implement a particular routine in R as much as I want to talk about the concepts and the context in which these and some of the big questions that arise with these new areas. So I know, Andrew pointed to some of the nice elements of data science that we would like to sort of make more a part of our profession. I think there are also differences and contrasts we want to emphasize. I'm always affected by Kathy O'Neill's book, The Weapons of Math Destruction, where when you allow the data to lead you too much, you can end up doing some very harmful things. And I think as measurement, people, we need to, reemphasize that measurement is very intentional. We want to know what it is that we're actually measuring before we make something a formal part of how we're going to, score people, for example. So, yeah, to answer your question, I think, my big thing is when there's more to cover, you have to kind of present things in different ways. And to me, what kind of loses first is the sort of programmatic way in which we kind of try to teach specific methods and their implementations. To me, the toolbox is just so large that it's more a matter of trying to help people navigate the toolbox than it is teaching them about any particular tool in that toolbox.
Andrew had a idea of maybe letting the attendees pose some questions now. And we can still discuss these issues around those questions, but I wanted to first ask Jennifer if she had anything to add at this point before we take on the participants' questions.
Nothing profound, but I did want to clarify that I think when we talk about these courses when I'm talking about these courses that focus on theories of social justice, critical race theory, that I don't believe that the measurement faculty should be the ones necessarily, probably shouldn't be for sure, teaching those courses.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Yes, I want to be very clear about that I don't think that, Jennifer Randall, Derek Briggs, Daniel Ho, and Daniel Bowden, Andrew Ho should go off and learn how to teach these courses. That'd be a very bad idea, probably. But I do think we can make those courses required. I mean, that is what we did in REMP, was we required students to take a social justice course. We defined what that was specifically, a page of the objectives, and then also identified courses that met that objective. And it's on our program of study. So we're also not counting on them to pick it as one of their electives. Because sometimes that can happen when you say, oh, students can take 4 electives and your college offers 600 courses. Well, technically any of those could, you could say, well, they have that option, but being very deliberate and intentional about what we mean by that and letting students know, this person is very good at teaching this. Go take that class with them. And then I also think I agree with a couple of the people in the chat around how we can start to integrate anti-racist practices into our curriculum and really thinking about contextualizing. I think it was Kristen Huff that told me, I should never teach classical test theory again without beginning with the history of measurement and eugenics and talking about alpha beta test and what that was, so that students understand from the beginning where this all kind of started. But then also thinking beyond that, in the 1960s literacy test, if we're talking about serving historically marginalized populations, we need to also understand why they hate tests, why they don't trust tests. Tests were used to keep them from voting for decades. Tests were used to relegate their students into special education classrooms where they just sat in there and banged their heads up against the wall for decades. And I feel like if students can have an understanding of that, then when they move into the actual process of test development and understand that having that knowledge will just inform the way they practice measurement moving forward.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I think Billy Buchanan had the first question, but he also posed some other comments and questions with regard to this issue of the social inequities and surrounding testing and how it's been used in the past. Billy, do you want to pose your question?
Sure. I guess the thing that I'm kind of most curious about and wondering about is what as a field we're doing, not just within the educational measurement student side of things, but with pre-service educators and educational leaders, or even in-service educators and educational leaders, to get them training to understand educational measurement and how it can be used, and the ways that using measurement can both help and harm the inferences that they make in their decision-making processes. So that's a tricky question. So I think if I understand it correctly, you're sort of asking a little bit about how educational measurement can be situated within pre-service teachers that are going into K through 12 educational settings. Is that correct, Billy? That, and even educational leadership programs that would typically be at the graduate school level. Graduate school, yeah. Yeah, it's a little tough. So it seemed like this reminds me a little bit about the push that has been at some points about sort of assessment literacy and that kind of language, which I've at one point I thought that there was something that graduate programs could do around this, where you could imagine offering these sorts of courses. I think one of the challenges with it is that this is something that I have to give credit to Laurie Shepard for mentioning to me, is that it's very difficult to do this in a content-free way. That to do this well in some ways, especially for pre-service K through 12 teachers, you really need to situate a lot of the educational measurement concepts within the content they'll be teaching. So in some sense, you'd really want to be doing this within those who are teaching mathematics. The way that you would think about educational measurement might look quite different than the way if you were teaching literacy. Or if you were teaching a language, or or teaching the arts. To teach a one-size-fits-all, here's test theory, like that's not necessarily going to be that helpful for a practitioner. So how to do that artfully, I think, is a real question. and maybe one reason why that hasn't taken off as an integrated approach. But I don't know if other people have some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think along those lines, it's helpful to think about how we can introduce a stronger psychometric component maybe into the types of courses these individuals are taking that are within their own content areas. So it may not be the idea of creating a course or something like that covers this and reaches everybody, but instead trying to inject a stronger psychometric component into a whole bunch of courses that sort of catch them and maybe at the most relevant place where they're learning about or becoming exposed to assessments.
You know, I won't sound as my response will be less happy. I think, so in our program, I feel like at UMass, quite frankly, I don't think the teacher education people like us that much. I think they believe, you know, we're test mongers and what we want to do is hurt kids, that we're not really interested in instructional best practices, and that because of us, they are constantly teaching to a test and not actually meeting the needs of their students. I think they have this really strong perception. You know, I break it up a little bit because I teach one class, classroom assessment, every other year with 20 kids, where I push back against that quite a bit, but there's still this entire environment. So I think it's really, we need to do more around trust building and partnerships and working with the teacher educator programs, and letting them know that we do also understand the context. And if we don't understand the context, making sure we get to that place so that they'll want to engage in a conversation about measurement. Because right now, I think they're not interested in that conversation because they think we're demons. And we should be, I think as a field, we should be working hard to move past that.
Okay, thank you. It's in some ways we as psychometricians and measurement experts need to work with others in our universities and schools to really have them value more quantitative methods as well as measurement. And that's, you know, a whole nother session, and I think we need it maybe next year. You know, how do we work with others so that they see the value in both quant methods and measurement? Okay, Neil, I think you had a couple of comments and questions in the chat room.
The thing of my comments and questions, I would like to hear more from folks, both committee members and others, about the idea that is starting to surface about integrating test theories in a single course. I've been thinking about that myself, haven't yet done so.
Yeah, I think it's really tricky. So I think if I take your question like that, a little bit is like, can you, if I take it correctly, you know, it's like, can you show a larger framework within different theories, how they fit together? You know, so one way to think about that is to say that from a statistical standpoint, you can think about, a general mixed effects framework, linear mixed effects or nonlinear mixed effects framework for showing that. You can also go just the route of showing, relationships between different IRT models and factor analysis and the linear classical test theory model and the like. One thing that I think is a little tricky about the question of when you do that is that sometimes I think it is valuable to first show the models themselves individually and get students to have some facility and comfort with that before you show the larger framework. It can be too much too soon. And so figuring out the timing of that, whether you start with the larger framework and then show the smaller pieces within it, or start with the smaller pieces and then later the reveal of how it can fit together, that can be valuable. There's also one other small point, which is that even though sometimes you can show how things fit together within a larger statistical framework, that doesn't mean that necessarily all the models within that framework are compatible. So I think the Roche model is a pretty nice example of that, right? That you can show how you can simply think of the Roche model as a constrained form of the 3PL. But there are a lot of reasons to understand that there are different perspectives on what you're trying to accomplish with the Roche model than with the 3PL or the Lauren Birnbaum tradition. And it's important for students to understand that, not necessarily to preach that there's one way to do it, but to help them understand those differences. And so sometimes if you just show the larger statistical framework, they can miss that.
So just one difference between what I'm thinking and what you were saying, which was I wasn't thinking necessarily you could come up with one grand theory to unify everything that we've done, but for people to understand coming out of the philosophy of science where the field of measurement has gone, the various theories that are out there. Right now we teach classical test theory, and oh, that's the thing to do until I take my next course. And within that we talk about equating, within that we talk about all different things. Whereas talking about test theories, their assumptions, the situations where they might be applicable, and then a separate course about the practices, where it's not just, oh, here's IRT equating, here is classical equating, here is who knows what other kind of equating, but here is equating. And depending on the data and the circumstances and how you go about collecting the data, here's some options that you might have.
Yeah, I think, we have, I think, tried to implement something like what you're describing in terms of a course that is able to simultaneously talk about, different theories at Wisconsin. We always have to position it kind of at the end of the graduate program because, I use Rod McDonald's test theory book, which I think does a nice job of trying to talk about all three of these test theories simultaneously, more from within the factor analytic framework. But to make it work, it's almost as though students need to have had a prior exposure to factor analysis. And so, usually I try to teach this course only when I know the majority of students are going to be ones that that are pretty much gone through the gamut of the course taking they can do in our program, and then have sort of the foundation to set from which to start to talk about and compare different methods to each other. I think it's very hard to do in an introductory measurement course where you're simultaneously trying to teach one theory and then saying, well, there's all these other ones as well, and you really kind of need to know all of them to really understand measurement. I mean, that becomes a bit overwhelming, I think.
Well, Neil, just went to one point, last point to your thing. I completely agree with your larger point. Like, I do think one really valuable thing is you could ask students, define measurement. What do you think measurement actually means? And have a tremendous conversation right there that really requires an understanding of the philosophy of science. And so where students actually get an introduction to that and when is really challenging, right? Like there are some really great things along these lines, like that Denny Boersboom has written about that I like to introduce students to, but when do you introduce that? In some ways, the question is like, if you do it too soon, it's a little overwhelming to sort of say that we actually don't have good agreed upon answers to the question of how we define measurement. so there's a real challenge in sort of when you sort of ask students to take the blue pill, so to speak. And if you do it too soon, you might lose them right off the bat. So that's something I grapple with.
Connie and Karen, do you want to jump into this conversation as well as Tim?
Yeah, if you don't mind, because in a way, my question relates to the philosophy of science in the sense that I was curious as to what your thoughts were on the value of experimental and quasi-experimental methods within psychometric programs, particularly in light of, Andrew, what you had talked about, that I, as a PhD student at Nebraska, am working on, and that is kind of a bridge between psychometrics and using some machine learning. So I'd be curious to know thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple notes in the chat about this because, you know, I teach, like, I'm the token psychometrician or testing and measurement person, and what's by and large like a program full of economists of education and policy analysts and the like. Again, Dan Corritt's retired just over a year ago or so now. So yeah, it's a challenge, and as I mentioned in the chat, it's trying to teach it in an integrated way as opposed to a defensive way, right? As opposed to, oh, after you do your analysis, make sure all your measurement boxes are checked, right? I mean, I do think it's very worthwhile to look at both, and as I mentioned in my remarks, both data science and sort of the sort of empirical econ of education of late. Basically use all these methods as means to an end. They're trying to answer policy questions. They're trying to solve a problem. They're trying to create a program that accomplishes a certain thing. And so it's very, very instrumental. And so why waste time with the intricacies of IRT? Just tell me what it does, show me how to do it, and then show me how to, and then let you move on. And so I think Derek's point about the blue pill, it's like, how many of our colleagues have actually taken it, Derek? is the compelling one, because I do think that, like, in my program in particular, which I don't bemoan this. I think it's great, but it's always nice to be forced to make the argument or remind yourself why these things matter, or for these particular purposes. But there are some hidden assumptions, of course, about the purpose of measurement underneath, and closer attention to why they're trying to do what they do may be worthwhile. So in short, I'd just say, like, I think appreciation of, for example, like whether you're using a raw score scale or my article about the problem with proficiency essentially shows that if you use a diff and diff for any proficiency based statistic, you're going to get differences that are totally artificial, and that kind of requires this, like, combination of, like, a measurement perspective where scales and distortion matter with the quasi experimental methods that you see these days. And I think that's the kind of integrated approach that I'd like all of our students to have.
This is Tim Victor. One thing that the very first assignment that I give my students is to read Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And I get them to think about what that means in relation to how do we know things, how this relates to the concept of measurement. And a lot of students struggle with that until we have that discussion, because, I have students who, from the medical school, from within the School of Education, all over the place. And I think one thing that we don't talk about enough is the concept of epistemology and ontology, and how that fits into the scientific method. Otherwise, all this stuff is just, there's an old expression that says, statisticians are like artists, they fall in love with their models. But in the beginning, it has to start in the beginning of what are we talking about and how do we know? And acknowledge our limitations about this sort of thing. And this goes along the lines of, the social justice conversation about, many of my students are also teachers. They're going on to become administrators. And I talk to them about, things like, I hear all the time from administrators, oh, we're going to take the people at the at the 10th percentile and we're going to raise them up to the 15th percentile. And I'm like, good luck, brother. You do realize that that's like going from here to Jupiter. And it's not the same as going from the 50th to the 55th percentile. Getting people to understand these very basic concepts. What are we talking about? What does this mean? As opposed to just saying testing is bad. No, testing is not bad in and of itself. It's what do we do with them? And then that leads into a nice discussion about the concept of validity. So I just wanted to get those concepts and thoughts off the chest and contribute to the conversation that way.
Thank you, Tim. Connie and Yvette, I think you had some questions or comments.
Yes. So actually, to all of the panelists, I was just wondering, I hear many of them talk about obtaining fundamental concepts in statistics and psychometrics, layering your knowledge and having access to opportunities to help build this knowledge in various measurement concepts. But as a graduate student at a small program, at a small university, a small program, psychometrics program, How do students like me gain access to some of the experts in the field to actually help build this knowledge and many of the fundamental concepts discussed in this session?
So that's a terrific question. I think one of the things the NCME as an organization is trying to do to help with that, one of the roles we're trying to take is with the items series, is that we're trying to get for different important topics that we think are core concepts in the field, to have people who are some of the best and have done some of the best research, or are most knowledgeable and also most skilled in presenting, to create modules around that, which is really integrated, that is actual presentations, reading materials. So if you haven't consulted already or haven't had a chance to, I'd really encourage everyone to check out at the NCME website, the items portal, where there are a lot of things that have been developed and are still in development. So that's one way in which we might be able, for students that are in smaller programs that may not have access to all of the different coursework, that's a great place to supplement and to get some exposure to that. The other thing I would plug is I would also say that coming to the NCME conferences, not just NCME, but also Psychometrics Society, CCSSO, there are smaller conferences, AERA and the regional conferences, and actually going to presentations and striking up conversations with people in the field is a really helpful way to get this sort of exposure as well. And with that, I'll pass it to others.
Any other comments from the
I mean, I'll just reiterate,
panelists?
there are some nice online resources. I mentioned already in the Psychometric Society page, there's a couple of very nice introductory videos that kind of provide an overview, one of which just deals with, what is psychometrics. The other by Willem Heiser talks about the history of psychometrics. Both of which are intended to be instructional and informative, and don't make assumptions. So I do think, even though there's a lot more work that can be done by various organizations that are associated with measurement, there are increasingly more resources, online resources available.
Thanks, Dan. Other questions came from Ramsey or Robin or D. Wright?
Yeah, my question was more on the format that people tend to use for their different psychometric classes. So in trying to fit a lot of things in, whether the monologue lecture style, how much percentage of class time is that used versus, say, time on the computer in a more group session or group discussions. And if that's changed, I mean, it's certainly changed over the last 6 months because of COVID, but if that had changed before that, and how that varies between the different topics.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, part of the answer, I think, to this question also goes along with the issue that we face with the small size of our programs. I think, at least at Wisconsin, we've often emphasized much more of an apprenticeship type of graduate training model, where students are working one-on-one with faculty, really from the start of the program, in terms of research topics and so forth, and that a lot of what's intended to be taught is happening in sort of those one-on-one interactions. I mean, we find increasingly, I think, that the amount of class time, number of classes that we can teach to our students, gets smaller, and that creates a huge challenge, obviously, but it also is what kind of makes it. I mean, they'll mostly be lecture format. I don't find as much value, I think, in having them sit in front of the computer and work things out. I don't find that to be as useful a form of instruction as it once was. Certainly when I was in graduate school, I think that was much more useful. but more of the lecture form, more of the discussion format, where people are posing questions, at least to me, has become more of the norm in terms of graduate courses I teach.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add that I've grown much more appreciative of the sort of calls for active learning. I try to do little quizzes in in each of my classes. Obviously, I'm gonna have to do a lot more of those, or do more outright flipping this next year when our entire program goes online for the entire school year, not just the fall semester. So I'm thinking a lot about that over this summer. I'm throwing into the chat like a little ditty that I wrote for like a teaching and learning week at Harvard that I called I quipped, I called it the 8-12-80 rule, and it's actually that every class. In every class, most of what you learn comes outside of the classroom, in the problem sets and assignments and P-sets and exams that you study for, and the collaborations that you have with your colleagues. So classes are already essentially flipped, and from that perspective, I thought as an instructor that I should spend much more time, practicing what I preach, focusing on the assessments that I'm crafting, the projects that I'm creating in my class, right? And I actually think, if you ask me, and perhaps this is what all of us would do, but if I want to see like what your class is like, I don't ask for the syllabus, I ask for what? The assignments, right? The final exam. Show me what you're measuring, right? Show me what you're asking folks to actually do. The syllabus only shows so much, right? And so it's the design. It's a design of the tasks that I think we should share much more often than we do our syllabi. Although, as I said earlier in the chat, we should share our syllabi too. But I want to segue this into a conversation, that I think relates to what Dan was saying, which is that, like, what did you learn in your doctoral program? How much of it was inside a classroom, and how much of it was outside of classes entirely? And the ETS internships that I had the privilege of doing, and all of the research projects, and some of you have centers that you sit in, and where you do active research. And so I think that whenever we talk about the teaching of measurement, we should definitely step far beyond the classroom and the syllabus and even the assignments, which I think are understudied, and focus more on all the sort of co-curricular experiences, which is frankly where I think most of this learning happens. And not to mention the professional organizations like NCME, where we could actually help. So I guess I'd say, like, the short answer to your question is I am switching my pedagogy to be much more active, but I also think that it's also just increasing my attention to all the co-curricular ways in which we learn.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any other comments from the panelists? I know we had some other wonderful questions and comments in the chat, but we're coming up to our end. Any last comments?
Yeah, I guess just a last thing is I do think this is sort of a work in progress. I think we need to have more conversations with one another about sort of what it looks like across. I think the contrast I have in mind to what Jennifer did with the survey is I'd like to see something that's a little bit more focused on defining a small group of known programs and really understanding in a more qualitative sense how they differ in the training they offer and the way that they're structured. I'm a little worried that the large survey approach isn't going to quite do the job, that we actually need to define more clearly what we mean by our graduate programs and what that looks like, how they're situated within a larger school of education, for example, or a psychology department, and what they're doing. And I think we could push things forward by having more of these sorts of conversations. So that's just the last thought. I really always intended this as just an opening of that door. So I hope we'll continue to do more of that.
Derek, as you're thinking about that, I know you're going to be taking a major role coming up, but thinking about an international program or a couple of international programs too, because I think we can learn from them.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. And I'm sorry for those attendees that we didn't get to your questions, but we've got them in the chat box, and hopefully we will be able to continue this conversation, and we'll be able to watch NCME and see what NCME will be doing to move this conversation forward. Thank you very much. Stay safe and well, everybody, and enjoy the next NCME session you're participating in.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Suzanne.
I'll just add that there's a great slate this month.